So welcome to section 12. Today I'm going to cover quotas, and then, as I said earlier, I'm going to go over a few practice problems according to what students are interested in, and if not, I can sort of go over a general review. So just to sort of think about sort of what we've gone through so far, we've seen things like tariffs in small and open large economies. We've also talked about preferential trade agreements. And so what now we're going to turn our attention to is sort of a different type of policies that the government can implement. And this is quotas. And basically the sort of the way that quotas function, as well as the way that as well as the sort of goal of quotas, is very similar to the goal of tariffs. And it's just to reduce import competition in order to increase domestic production. But we'll see they're very similar in terms of the implementation of tariffs. It's just a tariff is a price mechanism, and you can think of a quota as a quantity-based mechanism. However, I think the main thing that's going to differ between thinking about a tariff and a quota, other than the fact that one is regulating prices and the other is regulating quantities, is going to be that when we have a certain number of units of quotas, we can decide, the government, it says, okay, we're only going to let a certain number of imports in, but it can either say, choose to charge people for those quotas. It can give them out for free to various groups of members in society, or various variations therein. And so the welfare implications of the quotas are going to depend on how the government sees fit to allocate them. And so let's start by just graphing the consumer producer surpluses and possible losses under a quota. That one is given to home firms, so given to only domestic firms. Two is allocated in proportion to each firm's production in the previous year. The third is it's auctioned by the government. So each quota, you could think of that there's some price bidding for each one, and so you might think maybe it's we're in an auction where people have the right incentives to reveal the maximum willingness to pay that they have, and so that's going to reflect the total cost. So the ultimate price of each quota is going to reflect up to each person's marginal willing to pay for it. And then the fourth is going to be that it might come as a voluntary export restraint by the foreign country. And so that might come as the result of, say, some sort of input or some sort of trade restriction or trade agreement where the two countries have come to the conclusion that foreign isn't going to export for whatever reason, and so foreign enforces that. So the first scenario that we can think of is the case when the quota is given to home firms. And so just to sort of go over this quickly, basically the effects of that we can see of the effects that we can see of a quota on welfare in the scenario is very similar to what the effects of a tariff are. And so, for instance, the quota here is saying that you can have no more than this horizontal distance imported from foreign. And so, if initially under free trade, we'd have that the amount of imports would be given by the distance between the domestic supply curve and the domestic demand curve at the world price. Now what we have is, under this quota, we're only allowed to import a total number of goods equal to the quota. Of course, the fact that we're restricting import competition is going to lead to increased domestic prices. And so the whole point of having these trade mechanisms is to potentially sort of spur production by domestic producers. And so indeed, when we have less import competition, the price goes up. And so now here under the quota, domestic producers are willing to supply more, but the converse is that the domestic price has gone up. And so domestic consumers are willing to demand less. And so when we implement this quota, the price at home goes up to P tilde, and that is the price at which effectively domestic consumers and domestic producers are going to face. Of course, and the difference here is that we're going to think of this in terms of we can think of the country that's going to apply the quota as a large country. And so what that's going to mean is that when home, when home puts this trade restriction, which is a quota on however many imports it can demand from foreign, what it effectively that does is it reduces domestic demand or sort of import demand for that good. And so if you think that this policy reduces overall demand, then a shift of the import demand curve to the left is going to cause the overall price of the good to fall. And so the world price of the good is going to fall because home's demand is now much less in the world market. And so that's going to reduce the price to this PW tilde. And so the world price is now PW tilde, and the new price that domestic consumers and producers are facing is P tilde. So what that means is that there might be positive effects because, in essence, because we placed this trade restriction, we've now lowered the world price, and so we've actually gained some terms of trade from just this applying this quota. And all of this should be very straightforward because it's very similar to what we see with tariffs. And so consumers lose out the areas of A, B, C, and D because originally that was the area shaded by the consumer surplus. And so consumer surplus is just the total area that's above the price that they're consuming at. And so initially they're consuming at PW. Now they're consuming a PW tilde, and so they lose those areas. What do producers gain here? Well, again, producers gain the converse, and so producers here are going to gain areas A because now that they can produce at a price P prime, the area of consumer surplus is everything below that the price that domestic firms are selling at and above the supply curve. And so they gain area A. But of course, the quota basically is, if we have a free market, then a free market for auctions, which elicits people's willingness to pay for each given permit, then what's the value of this permit? Well, we know that we could, for instance, if we had one quota, we could sell a good at the price P tilde. So we can, if we have a quota, that means we can import a good at a price of PW tilde and sell it at a price of P tilde. And so what's the value of one unit of a quota? It's just the difference between the domestic price and the new world price. And so if we had a fair, efficient market for bidding for these quotas, each purchaser of a quota would be willing to pay up to as a result, the price of the quota would be exactly equal to the difference between P tilde minus PW tilde. And so what that means is that the total amount that is the value of these quotas are the areas C plus C. So you're multiplying the value of one unit of a quota times all of the number of units of the quota that we have. And so that's going to be the sort of total revenue or the total value of each of those quotas. Now, in this case, we give the total value of those quotas to the home firms. And so those areas C to E go directly to the producers. And so all we have to do to figure out the net welfare gain is we just add up those areas, and we can see that A and C are going to cancel out. And so what we're left with is positive E and negative B and D. Likewise, we can think of a different scenario where the quota is allocated in proportion to a firm's production in the previous year. And so, the effects on consumers' welfare here are going to be all the same. And again, it's the same quota, so we have all of the same price effects. We have all of the same changes in imports. We're just thinking about who gets different slices of the pie here. And so if the quota is allocated in proportion to the firm's production in the previous year, well, then in the previous year, the firms that were producing more we're going to allocate it in response to, and we're going to allocate tariff revenue to those firms that were importing. Or so we're going to give C&E to these to the sort of foreign exporters. And so because foreign had a larger share had a larger share of imports initially, we're going to give because foreign was exporting a given number of units before, we're going to give all of the quota revenue to those foreign producers. And so what the sort of in proportion to the firm's production means is that, for instance, if foreign had 4 firms and they were all exporting to home, then what that's going to mean is that all of those quotas, we're going to give them to each firm with respect to how much they were importing in the year before. Don't be sort of confused by what the in proportion to the firm's production means. This means in proportion to the firms that were producing that were then exporting to our domestic market. And so therefore here, the only thing the producer's gaining, unlike last time, they're not gaining C&E because they're not being given, the domestic producers are not being given the quotas. Now it's the foreign producers who are being given the quotas, and so they only gain A. In contrast here, these A's cancel out, but we're left with a negative welfare gain of negative B, negative C, and negative D. So we know that here, when the quotas are allocated into in proportion to the firm's production, we know that we're going to have a negative net welfare gain or a negative or a net welfare loss. In contrast, here it's going to be the size of E, B, and D that's going to depend whether or not our home country is going to gain or lose from this policy. So similarly, we can think of policy 3. This is going to be when a quota is auctioned by the government. And so again, this is going to be very similar to the situation which the quota is given to the home firms, except now instead of giving it to the producers, the government's going to capture that revenue instead. Of course, although the quota revenue is given, the revenue from the auction of the quotas is the same. We're giving it to a different we're giving it to a given party, in this case the government. But overall, if we just don't care who the tariff revenue, or sorry, who the quota revenue is going to, if we don't care about whether or not that's going to the government or going to the producers, and we just sum it up overall, the net welfare gain is the same as if we give the quota revenue to producers instead. And so as long as we're giving the quota revenue to any sort of group of parties at home, then the case is going to be the same in terms of net welfare gain. And so one thing I'll note here is that this welfare implication is exactly the same as in tariffs. Usually we think of tariff revenue as being taken in by the government. And so in terms of who receives what sources of revenue, this quota being auctioned by the government is probably the most similar case to, directly similar case to the case of a tariff, which the revenue is collected by the government. Okay, and then moving on, we're just going to think of having the quota be a voluntary export restraint by the foreigners. And so you can think of this as basically, certain countries will engage in a trade deal, and as part of the terms of that trade deal, two countries might come to agreement that they say, in order for us to give you sort of preferential, trade, trade agreements, or sort of terms of agreement on sort of what tariffs and quotas and things like that, they might agree to say that a given country can only import a certain number of units, but they're not going to sort of enforce that. And so, what that effectively means is that, or they rely on the foreign country to enforce that instead. What that effectively is going to mean is that because foreign is basically being told that it only can it only can export a given number of units now, that means that, sure, a foreign can only export the number of units equal to the quota, but remember that foreign is producing these units at a price of PW tilde, and it can sell them on the domestic market at P prime, which is higher. And so each of those firms is going to be able to gain basically the revenue C plus E that comes from basically the fact that that it can, each firm that's still allowed to export can produce at a lower cost and sell it at a higher one. And so in this case, the quota as a voluntary export restraint by the foreign government is the same as having the quota be allocated in proportion to various foreign firms' production in the previous year. So it's the exact same case. So does anyone have any questions about that? And then I have a sort of more numerical example, but that's roughly the different cases that you can think of in terms of, there are others, but those are the main ones that you can think of as in terms of who might be allocated quotas.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So for the second case, when quota is allocated in proportion to firm's production previous year, so in this case, like, why are we referring to like foreign producers, not the home producers? Like, I don't quite get what is the purpose of giving all the quota revenue to foreign companies compared to like home firms?
Yeah, well, the idea is to say that basically you would, you're harming the you basically want to only give quotas in proportion that, like, you want to look at how many firms were, importing, and then in terms of, what firm produced the most imports, you'd want to give that firm the most number of quotas. Why you'd want to do that? It certainly isn't as beneficial for the home country. That's for sure. But these sort of agreements may come out of some sort of trade negotiations, and so certainly it would be better for, if you just gave the quota, the revenue from the quota auctions to, domestic producers. But in this case, we're referring to giving the quota to the foreign producers. So basically, in the back of your head, you should just think, this came out of a sort of a trade agreement. We're not sure exactly how, these agreements come about, but like, this is the outcome, is that, country A and country B decided that, country A can put a quota, but country A has to give those quotas directly to the foreign producers in proportion to how much they were producing the year before the quota came about.
Got it. And what's the difference between this case and the last case?
So in practice, nothing really. The idea would be basically that, like, there's no, in number two, the idea is that there are some sort of quotas that then, the home government gives out to foreign firms. Whereas the idea in four is that the foreign country is going to say, like, they might not give the same quotas to the same firms. The foreign country might say, okay, now only firm, XYZ can export an amount to the quota. And so the difference is subtle, but it just means that, in two, the quotas are going to be allocated, evenly in response to, how big each foreign producer was. Whereas in four, foreign country might sort of say only these firms can export, or, so it's not the quotas, the sort of the allowance to export might not be the same, have the same distribution structure. But in terms of welfare, they're the same. So in practice, I think you should just think that they're the same. Yeah. In terms of diagrams, you should think of them as being the same. So yeah. Okay. So unless there are any other questions, in which case feel free to interrupt me. I'm now going to move on to a numerical example. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to think of, an example and give you a quota and ask you, to compute how world prices change, how domestic prices change, and then, calculate these rates. Calculate the size of the sort of net welfare change. And so I'll go through this quickly because it's basically just, putting math to this, but, if I'm going too quickly, feel free to stop and interrupt me. So suppose there are two countries that are going to be home and foreign. We're going to think of home similar to the sort of graphical example that we had before as a large country. And then we're going to think that a single homogeneous good, a USB adapter, is going to be produced by both countries. And all of the numbers here are going to refer to a USB adapter in terms of millions. I'll drop that, but you should just, we've done that to make the numbers a little smaller. Home's demand and supply functions are written like so. And likewise, they're written as they are on the slides for foreign's demand and supply functions. And so getting into problem one, what we want to do is we want to derive home's import demand and foreign's export supply of USB adapters. And then we want to solve for the world price without trade barriers, and then the number of foreign exports or conversely home imports, because they're going to be the same. And so basically what we can think is that, we have that, for instance, if we wanted to derive home's import demand, then home's demand, so demands from home looks like, and I think I need to, home's demand looks like 20 minus 5p, and then home supply looks like 5 plus 5p. And so then, we want to solve for home's import demand. And so what's home import demand going to be? Well, it's just going to be equal to QD minus QS. And so what's that going to give us? Well, that's going to give us 15 plus 10p. And so that's how we would just derive home's import demand. Likewise, we could do so for, so anyway, this is what we would have for home's import demand curve. And this is what we'd have for foreign's export supply curve. Again, all of this is fairly straightforward. Setting sort of foreign's export supply curve equal to home's import demand curve, we obtain that the world price is 1. To figure out what the total number of exports is, then we just plug that price of 1 back into this either the import demand curve or the export supply curve. They'll be equal, and then we'll figure out that this will give us that foreign imports, alternatively foreign exports, alternatively home's imports, are going to be equal to 5 million units of electronics. So that was problem 1. So now problem 2 is that we're going to suppose that the domestic country is going to impose an import quota where a maximum of 2.5 million units of USB adapters can be imported. And the question that we're going to ask is what's going to happen to the world price PW tilde, the world price PW tilde of USB adapters. What's going to happen to the domestic price P tilde of USBs, and then the number of imports. And so we can note that if we just sort of go back to here, we saw that before the quota, the number of imports of USBs in home was 5 million. And so because 5 million is more than the amount of the quota is going to bind. In contrast, if the quota was, say, 7.5 million, then the number of imports that we'd have in equilibrium would be less than the quota, and the quota wouldn't do anything. So quotas, they may or may not do something based on, in equilibrium, how much we were importing anyway. But since the quota is less than the number that we would have liked to otherwise import, we're going to have that the quota is going to bind. And so we know just already that the new number of imports is going to be 2.5 million USB adapters. And the reason I can say that is that in the absence of this policy, we'd want to import more. And so you can sort of think, well, it's going to be natural that they're going to want to import as many as they can. And in this case, that would be 2.5 million. So now to solve for PW prime, all we're going to do is we're going to take our import demand curve from before, and instead where it was equal to this, all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to say this has to be equal to 2.5. And then what I'm going to do is going here, I'm just going to set this equal to the same export supply curve. The reason that the export supply hasn't changed is that foreign we can think of this, home as only choosing to import 2.5 million, but foreign's export supply hasn't changed. And so when we set these equal, we can sort of solve the math out for this. And so basically, if you want to solve the math out for this, we'll see that, we'll have, and I'm sorry, my pen isn't actually working. So we'll have 5/2 equal to -10/2 and plus 10p. And so what that's going to give us is it's going to give us 15 halves is equal to 10p, which is going to give us that 15. I'm sorry, I'm writing with my mouse, so apologies about the difficulties, but a 15/20 is equal to p, and so this is equal then to 3/4, which is what we got here. And so this gives us that the new world price must be equal to 3/4 or 7.5. However, of course, in response to the reduced number of imports, the domestic price has to rise due to the reduced foreign competition. And so to determine the new domestic price P, we need to figure out, what would the domestic price be that would justify having an import demand of 2.5 million. And so it's just going back and setting this import demand equal to 2.5 and then solving that price. And so if we do the same thing there, I'm going to skip the math this time, we can solve for P and it's equal to 5/4. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, so that's what's going to happen to the price, the prices when we apply this tariff. So yeah. Okay, so problem 3 is going to ask, now that we have these. Oh, sorry, was there a question?
Yeah, I have a question about problem 2.
Sure.
So in terms of getting the new world price and getting the new domestic price, what's the difference in plugging in the equations?
So basically, all we have here is that we need to set basically. I mean, the way you can think about this is we want to solve for the world price in foreign's export supply, which would so you could sort of ignore this and you could just say, okay, foreign's export supply needs to be 2.5 million. How much is the price going to decrease in response to that decrease in demand? And so we can set basically the price that foreign is going to export at is going to be given by the world price. And so we can just set foreign's export supply equal to 2.5, where the price here that foreign is taking into consideration is going to be the new world price. In contrast, we do the same thing to figure out the domestic price, but we want to make sure that, basically the thing that we can think about is like homes prices are going to rise until we have prices that are justify us only importing 2.5 million, because you could think, because we're only allowed to import 2.5 million, then there's 2.5 million units of unfilled demand relative to what we had before, and so more consumers are going to say, hey, I still want more units of USB adapters. And so they're willing to pay more for USB adapters, and so the price is going to have to go up domestically. And so basically, in short, you just basically set the new quota equal to the export supply, solve for the new world price, and then in home you set the new number of imports equal to the import demand function with respect to domestic prices. And then that's what you get as is the new domestic price.
Got it. So for the domestic prices, when we set the import demand to the 2.5.
Yeah. So this, sorry, this P tilde here is the new domestic price. So this is, yeah. So that P tilde right there, this is the new domestic price. So and what's the difference between the, never mind. So where we have that the domestic price is higher than the new world price. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, cool. So problem 3 is going to ask what's going to be the equivalent import tariff to this quota in terms of effects on prices and import quantities. And so the idea is, we know what the effects of prices are, when we have a tariff, or sorry, excuse me, we know what the effects of prices are when we had this quota. We know that it's going to increase domestic prices to 1.25. It's going to decrease the world price to 0.75, and it's going to reduce imports to 2.5 million. So we want to find an import tariff T that's going to increase the cost of imported USB adapters by foreign by T. It's going to increase their price exactly by T, such that we replicate all of the sort of features that we saw under the quota. And so with a tariff, the tariff doesn't affect the export supply curve for foreign. You could think that it just remains the same. The only thing that's going to change for foreign under a tariff is it might change the world price that it's exporting at. So that's why I'm writing PW prime prime there. So that's why I'm writing this is PW prime prime. But now what we're going to do is we're going to look for a tariff T, which is going to lower the world price by as much as the quota did. And so the quota before, lowered the world price to 3/4. And so we're going to look for T such that we have that same result. And so to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to think that the import demand curve is going to shift downwards. And the reason is that the price, the tariff is going to raise the world price effectively by T. And so recall that P prime prime here is just equal to whatever the new world price is once we apply the tariff plus T. And so the domestic price is basically whatever the world price is plus whatever the tariff ends up being. And so for now, we don't know that. It's just T. And so that's why, once I multiply PW prime prime and T out by -10, I end up getting that my new import demand with this, tariff, which increases the cost of the USB adapters from foreign, it now looks like this. And so now all I have to do is I'm going to set export supply and import demand equal to one another, and then I'm just going to solve for what must be the new world price P prime prime. And so I can do this out here. Sorry. I can just basically set these equal. You can see that if I add 5 on both sides, this becomes 20. And then I can add 10p on both sides. So I can add 10p on both sides, and this becomes 20 pw. So this cancels out. And so what I'm going to be left with is I'm going to be left with I'm going to be end up left with 10t is equal to 20 minus 20p pw prime prime. And so if I divide both sides by 10, then what that gives me is it gives me 2 minus 2 pw. And so that gives me this. And so then if I plug in for PW, so remember that I'm looking for a tariff that gives me a new world price. It's equal to exactly the old world price. The old world price was 3/4. And so plugging that in gives me that my new specific tariff has to be equal to half. And so T has to be equal to 0.5. And so that's gonna give the same world prices as before, and I'm just gonna leave it to your practice to show that this is gonna lead to the same level of imports. The reason that we think that it would is because if we have the same prices, then we would have the same imports, but you can check this on your own Okay, so then problem 4 is going to ask what would be the effect on homes' total welfare if this quota of 2.5 million is auctioned, is just auctioned off to the highest bidder, as well as if the same quota is distributed for free to foreign producers. What was there a question in the background? Okay. So what so basically in the auction, as I said earlier, the auction is gonna elicit exactly what people's willingness to pay is, and so um, the effect on welfare is going to be exactly equal to the tariff case, and foreign firms are going to be willing to pay half per unit of the quota. And so filling in for each of these values, this is basically just the plot for both what the effects of the quota are on domestic supply and domestic demand, as well as the effects of the quota on homes import demand and foreign export supply. So you could think that for one, we sort of see the same effects. We sort of see the exact same diagram as we saw for the quota before, but we're just filling this in with numbers. So initially the world price was 1. When we apply the quota, we are only allowed to import 2.5 units, and so 2.5 units is the difference between 13.75 and 11.25. And so now we're only allowed to import that many units, and so that's going to lower the world price to 7.5, increase the domestic price to 1.25. And then, of course, if the way I modeled this before was to say home can only import a number of units, but equivalently, what this does is, if you looked at the intersection of foreign export supply and homes import demand here, that led to a level of imports M1. But instead, you could just think that foreign export supply with a quota is just fixed here because it can only ever be up to 2.5. And then that's going to yield basically the intersection of 2.5 and foreign export supply is going to yield the new world price. That's saying graphically exactly what we did with math. And then the intersection of 2.5 and homes import demand is going to give us the new domestic price. And so this is showing graphically exactly what we did. And here, this area here is C, so this corresponds to this area. And then these areas are B plus D. So again, we have all the same results because if the quota is auctioned, then the government gains the revenue. So it's the exact same case in terms of welfare as a tariff. And then the only thing that we have to do here is now, before we were just sort of saying, here's the effect on welfare. It's all of these sizes. But since we now have numbers, we can now sort of compute what the size is of, each of these each of these polygons. And so, or rectangles in the cases of C and E. And so all we have to do is, do fairly standard, we just have to look at the, basically the area of each of these polygons. E, you can, I can go over, I can go over this back and forth, but E has an area of 3/4. B and D both have an area of 5/16. And so the net welfare gain here is going to be 1/8. And so we're going to see that basically what that means is that when we auction the quota, the country as a whole in net terms is going to gain. And so it's worth noting that, that's the net welfare gain. So that's the net, the gain sort of overall. But of course, if you look at individual agents, consumers are hurt. Consumers are hurt from the policy, even though producers and the government are going to gain. And then the next situation we can think of is when the quota is distributed for free. And so it's given basically for free directly to these sort of foreign exporters. And so in contrast, the sort of revenue from those, the revenue that's being raised by each of those quotas isn't going to the domestic producers, and so now you know, domestic producers are only gaining A, whereas before they were gaining A and C. Otherwise, and as well, oh sorry, actually relative to the earlier case, it was the government that was gaining C plus C. Sorry, I misspoke there. So the government's not gaining any revenue, where before the government, it wasn't the firms, the government was receiving C plus C. And so when we add those up again, those give us negative B, C, and D. And so the only thing that we need to figure out is then what's the size of each. And so from before, we know that the area of these triangles B and D is both 5/16. And then all we need to figure out is then the area of C. It's going to be the same as E. And so that's 3/4 again. And then the net welfare loss, when we add all of these up, it gives us negative 11/8. And so we have a net welfare loss of 1.375. So that's all I have. Is there any questions about this? I'm happy to go through the math of how we calculate each of these areas if anyone would like. So just let me know about that.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So for problem 3, with the tariff, you mentioned that it doesn't change the export supply curve, but it only, can you like kind of go over the change in the curves like with tariff compared to quotas?
Yeah. So for instance here, what you could think is that so when you have a so when you have basically, and to be fair, you can model the impacts as saying it. I think it's more intuitive to say that it's going to shift import supply down, and so when we have a tariff, right, that's going to shift import supply down by T, and so this is going to be M minus T. But assuming that we're at that we're using the same tariff as we had before, where the shift down of this import supply curve is going to sort of yield the new intersection with export supply that's going to give us the same amount of those imports M2. And so, in graphically speaking, it's the same as the results are going to be the same as shifting things down here. Does that make sense?
So basically, like tariff only shift the import demand curve, but then quotas shift the export supply curve.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I mean, the thing is, you can model how. I mean, likewise, you could say, you could actually say that, another way. So I like to think of tariffs as shifting down the import supply curve, but you can do the same. You can get to the same point if you say, well, tariffs actually, they shift left the export supply curve because they make export supply, they increase it by T. And so instead of thinking about this import supply curve shifting down, you'd have the same result on imports. But the thing that you need to think about is that so the shift is now here is telling you what happens to the new home price, the new domestic price, and then you just need to relate the new domestic price to the new world price by this equation. And so you can either solve for, when you're solving for the effect of tariffs or quotas, you can either solve for, when you're solving for the effect of tariffs, you can either solve for, what's going to be the new domestic price or what's going to be the new world price first. But you need to sort of, regardless of the way you conceptualize these shifts, it's just solving for either the domestic price or the world price. But in either case, when you sort of back through and use these relationships, you'll end up getting both the same domestic and world price for both. So I like to think of, tariffs as shifting down the import demand curve, because that's more intuitive to me. But you could also, like when we sort of go back here, like another way to do this is just to sort of say, like, sorry, clear. So another way to do this is not to add the tariff on here, but it's rather to express this world price in terms of the new domestic price. And so instead you could rewrite it as this. And so then you just set these two equal. And so this is the same as, this would be the same as shifting the export supply left rather than shifting the import demand curve now. Instead, rather than solving for the new world price here, if we did something like this and we set these equal, we would be solving for the new domestic price here. So you can sort of, it doesn't really matter where you sort of, which curve you shift in response to a tariff or a quota. You just need to keep in the back of your mind that, you know, regardless, whichever one that you shift is going to be you're going to need to solve for that in terms of either the domestic price or the new world price, and then go back to sort of figuring out what the other one that you didn't figure out was.
Got it. So with the tariff, like there will be a change in both the domestic price and the world price.
So yes, that's right. And same with a quota. So, but that's only true in the large economy. And so, you know, the point that you know, the sort of this whole section, we've assumed that we're in a large economy. So if, for instance, home is small, then it's not going to sort of reduce the world price and here. And so the reason is that, you know, if for instance the world is small and that we're not going to have this upward sloping export supply curve, the export supply curve is just going to be flat. So export supply is going to be fixed. So import demand is only going to be driven by changes in the domestic demand curve. Sorry, in the domestic import demand curve.
So basically, like if the economy is small, then the export supply curve is flat.
Exactly.
And all the change will just happen to the import demand curve.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Got it. And
because having a flat export supply curve means that, you know, home can't affect the price by any shifts of its you know, import demand, regardless of whether or not it applies a tariff. So if it applies a tariff, it might move to the left, import demand, but, you know, because export supply is totally flat, it has no effect on the world price at all.
oh, got it. That makes sense. Yeah.
And so this like what changes here is that this area E goes away.
Got it. That is for a small economy.
Yes.
Got it. So I just have a follow-up question on problem 2. So kind of in order to get the new world price and the new domestic price, after we have the quota, I know we have, in order to get the new world price, we plug in, we set the export supply curve equals to 2.5, which is like
Right.
the new amount that foreign companies are allowed to export. So that will give us the new world price, right?
Right. Exactly.
But then in order to get the new domestic price, I was wondering what equation do we set equals to 2.5?
Yeah, so this is import demand. So
Oh,
maybe I think, sorry about this. So maybe the easier way to see this is basically we just want to go here, and so what we do is we say, okay, so when we set export supply equal to 2.5, that's solving for the new world price, whereas when we set import demand equal to 2.5, that's solving for the new domestic price. And so that's solving for this. And so this equation gives you the new world price, and this equation gives you the new domestic price, new home price.
oh, got it. That makes sense.
Yeah. So So that's what I was sort of saying back to this is like going back to this graphically, you can sort of see when you see here, like the intersection of 2.5 and the import demand curve gives you the domestic price, new domestic price, and then the intersection of the new import restriction 2.5, the intersection of that with the export supply curve gives you the new world price. And so this is sort of graphically, how you figure out how that math is working.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. And I'm happy to answer any more questions that you have. If you have it, yeah, I'm happy to stay here for a little bit.
Yeah, so for the preferential trade agreements part, I feel like I'm just a little bit confused about. I feel like it's a little bit confusing with different scenarios where it is beneficial, like it is improving welfare. Like,
right.
yeah, I wonder if you can go over that. Like,
Yeah, sure. So you want me to go over like section 11, basically?
Yeah. And also, what is MFN exactly?
Yeah. So let me pull up this and then I'll go through that. Sorry. So MFM, it refers to most favored nation clauses, and so I have a good sort of example on that, which might sort of help or maybe not. So most favored nation clauses are basically when you go to the sort of I'm trying to make sure I can pull this open. But most favored nation clauses are basically like for all countries that are in the WTO, they all agree sort of multilaterally to sort of lower tariffs amongst each other. And so when you hear of things like the WTO had the Uruguay round and stuff like that, those are basically big meetings of all the WTO member countries where they're all agreeing to lower tariffs on each other. And when they sort of agree to set those tariff rates, they set one tariff rate, which is called the most favored nation clause. And so it means any country who's a member of, who's in the most favored nations category receives one sort of lower rate that we've negotiated with all other countries to sort of reduce trade barriers in the same way. And so generally, like the most favored nation clause is like, if I'm the US and I'm thinking of, trading with, a certain country and a certain good, as long as I don't have another trade agreement or certain, law with them, if they're a member of the WTO, I apply a most favored nation tariff rate, and I can't apply any tariff rate higher than that. If you're not a most favored nation, I can apply whatever tariff I want on you. And so potentially I could be applying a higher tariff on you than otherwise.
So that is like increasing welfare for all countries.
Yeah, the idea is that it, because since all countries are in the WTO, the idea is that you're having, since you have these most favored nation clauses, you might avoid the sort of tit for tat, trade increases. And so, the WTO does allow some room to increase tariffs away from the sort of most favored nation clause, particularly in trade disputes and things like that. But by and large, it's a mechanism that's designed so that to lower trade barriers throughout the world. And so I can sort of show you what those look like if you're curious.
So what about the optimal tariff?
Yeah, so the optimal tariff is different. So it's basically designed, like the reason we have most favored nation clauses is designed to avoid what our countries might be optimally setting a tariff. And so, you can think of large countries, and you can think like if, for instance, countries are facing upward sloping export supply, that is the world price does respond to how much they're demanding of the good, then it might actually be better in a welfare standpoint for them to apply tariffs. And so the idea is that like when we have these preferential trade agreements, like from an individual country's perspective, it might be a better idea to apply tariffs. But the problem is when, is when it's just two countries that might be large countries that are thinking about this. Maybe one country is large in terms of one good and the other country is large in terms of the other good. And so they'd say, in absence of the WTO, they'd say, well, we've calculated that if we apply a tariff, that's actually going to reduce the cost of your imports. It's going to reduce the world price. And that terms of trade effect is actually going to benefit me. The problem is that when both home and foreign are playing these tariffs on sort of, you could consider that there's two separate equally sized goods. If we sum up the sort of loss in the other market and the gain that we have, then both countries are going to lose. Of course, that's sort of a suboptimal outcome, this sort of Nash equilibrium here, relative to the case in which we weren't playing tariffs. But for each individual country, starting out from a no tariff world, it's always going to be more beneficial for you to play a tariff. And so we might lead into a world in which countries are, constantly engaging in these trade disputes. But what the WTO is trying to do is trying to lock countries into agreement to having no tariffs, which, are a better outcome than an outcome in which everyone places tariffs on each other. It's just, it requires a lot of sort of multilateral coordination and sort of like countries basically tying their hands behind their backs, saying, because you're a member of the WTO, I won't be able to, increase tariffs on you to their optimal level. Of course, this is thinking about a large country, and so remember that if a country is a small country, then this export supply curve is going to be flat, and the welfare effects of a tariff are always going to be negative. So in this case, they would be, I believe they're, I think there was minus B, C, D. So that's always going to be negative. So the gains are only going to be for like these gains from applying an optimal tariff are only going to be, there's only going to be gains if you're a large country.
Got it. So with tariff, there is only going to be gains like for large countries, but not for small countries.
Exactly. And so the idea is that the WTO is trying to sort of, tie the hands of large countries behind their backs because, for instance, the idea could be, and I think this conflicts with the empirical evidence, which is what Professor Rodriguez-Clare went over in class. But the idea could be that by applying a tariff, the U.S. could decrease the world prices of goods, and so maybe the U.S. might have an incentive to do so. Of course, that's not what we saw in the sort of empirical evidence with the sort of trade war with China tariffs, but you could think maybe there's other goods the U.S. could be sort of considered a large country, but the WTO serves to sort of help sort of constrain large countries to all act in each other's all act in sort of overall best interests and not in their own sort of best interests, which are sort of damaging to sort of other countries.
So is WTO like ultimately want to have no tariff for all countries?
Yes.
Okay, but like in realistically, it's not achieving like no tariff. It's still like lower tariff among countries.
Yeah, I mean, so there's multiple rounds of WTO negotiations, and basically, historically, the idea has been to lower tariffs in each and every round. Of course, the WTO negotiations are very complicated, and now that's not just tariffs; it's things like like food regulations of like in order to import a certain food from a certain country, it has to fulfill with these rules. And so these trade negotiations, that is to say, these trade negotiations are very complicated, and there's a lot of things to cover. But in general, the idea behind each of these rounds is just to eventually lower and lower, and like have these barriers fall even more.
Got it. So I have another question. So in the lecture, the professor mentioned like by eliminating tariff among member countries, PTA necessarily improve welfare for member countries. And that is like false. But I was wondering like why is it not improving welfare for member countries if tariffs are eliminated?
Yeah, so the idea is that you could have potentially trade diversion, and so the idea is that you'd have basically, like, by having a preferential tariff, like, or sorry, a preferential trade agreement, excuse me, you could be leaving out countries that you were exporting from before, and who in the absence of tariffs would be more productive. And so, in the absence of having these trade costs, you would actually export from someone who you're not now exporting from, who's in the preferential trade agreement. And so the idea is that, like, without trade costs everywhere, you would be importing from the more productive country, who would give you better terms of trade, that is to say, lower prices on the goods that you're importing. But with the preferential trade agreement, you're importing from someone who actually is less productive, or you're importing from someone who you have worse terms of trade, or in effect paying higher prices. So the loss in welfare is that you're basically trading with a sort of less productive country relative to what you would who you would want to trade with in the absence of a PTA.
So does trade diversion always lead to like decreasing welfare or no?
Yeah, I think when we think about the effects of PTAs, we want to think about the two effects of trade creation and trade diversion. And so, ultimately PTAs are gonna cause a bit of both. So, because they lower trade barriers on sort of member countries, they might induce more trade. And so that's a positive aspect of these preferential trade agreements. And so that needs to get weighed against those welfare decreasing effects of trade diversion. And so it depends on how much trade those things create, and then how much they divert.
Oh, got it. So basically, like WTA doesn't like necessarily improve or decrease, or like increase or decrease welfare. It kind of depends on trade diversion and trade creation, for which.
Yeah, PTA, yeah,
Okay.
a PTA. And so you could have certain PTAs where you're in a PTA with these productive countries, and that's welfare increasing because you are now trading with the more productive supplier, without sort of having restrictive tariffs. And so it depends on how productive are the countries that you're now trading with under the PTA versus the ones that you've left out. And so if you're trading with the productive countries, then PTAs are great. If you're trading now with unproductive countries that you shouldn't have been importing from, except for the PTA, then that's bad.
Got it.
Oh, hi, Tibble. Hope everyone has a good rest of the semester. Good luck studying. I also want to show you my little rat. And yeah, anyway, I hope everyone has a good rest of the semester, have a good summer, and best of luck studying for finals. Take care.